Welcome to Wesley Impact. This is the television program of Wesley Mission, where we do our very best to share with you the work that we do every day of the year, both in our community services and also across our congregational life. October in Australia is Mental Health Month, and today I'll be speaking with someone who I can readily say is a leader in the field of mental health and in particular suicide prevention, Alan Woodward. Alan is a commissioner at the National Health Commission and has contributed to suicide prevention policy and programs for over 20 years in Australia. I'll take the time to have an in-depth discussion with Alan about some of the mental health challenges facing all Australians and also look at some of the things we can all do to take proactive, positive steps to improve our own mental health as well as keep an eye out for the people around us. Later in the program, I'll continue my message series filmed in Wesley Theatre earlier this year, looking at what it means to be a people with sharp minds that are focused on achieving justice as we seek to reflect the love, grace and mercy of God. Now, I mentioned Alan Woodward as a commissioner at the National Health Commission. He's also a strategic advisor on the quality and innovation within Suicide Prevention Australia and has held various executive roles at Lifeline Australia for 14 years, including at the Lifeline Research Foundation. Welcome, Alan. It's fantastic to have you with us today. You've had a long career in mental health and suicide prevention, but where did it all start?
Well, it started really in an unexpected way, and that is my background is in social science and social policy, business administration and journalism. So I'm not your typical person to come into the field of mental health and wellbeing, and far less suicide prevention. But I was doing a lot of work in those days around community services, strengthening community and community engagement, looking at issues such as housing, aged services. And I became aware of how important mental health issues were to so many people and how issues of suicide were impacting so many communities. So it's like the issues started to come to my attention rather than me setting out to address them.
Now, 20 years ago, the conversations we were having around mental health, if we were having conversations at all, were very different to the ones we're having today. What have been some of the changes, fundamental changes that you've seen?
Well, yes, things have changed in 20 years. Even that we're having this conversation today is illustrative of that. We have become, as an Australian society, more willing to talk about our mental health and wellbeing and to confront the impacts of suicide in our community and to actively seek ways to prevent suicide. Now, 50 years ago, that was almost unheard of, and 20 years ago, it was just starting to come through. We're going through a pandemic at the moment, and the fact that we can even talk about the mental health impacts of the pandemic and identify services and supports for people as a result, to me is a sign of how far we've come in the last 20 years.
So you've seen a shift. Now, what's been a catalyst for those changes, do you think?
You know, I think the main catalyst has actually been people. People with lived experience of mental health struggles, of suicide, and of caring for people with struggles and suicidality. It's those people that have come forward and through community groups, non-government organisations, government agencies and services have been able to find their voice and push for change. And we've seen a greater awareness at government policy level around mental health and suicide prevention, which is wonderful, and seeing that responsiveness in our political leaders. But at the end of the day, they're responding to what ordinary people are telling their local representatives. Their stories are coming forward.
Alan, you've been involved in executive and advisory roles in the areas of mental health and suicide prevention. What have been some of the programs or initiatives that you've seen that have been most effective in shifting the dial on these issues?
Well, I do think that there is a really big place for services such as Lifeline and other crisis support services. And I guess that's something dear to my heart, having worked for many years in Lifeline. But services that are not necessarily clinical, but are reaching out, providing a compassionate support for others. Some of those programs operate in schools, such as Batir, which trains people to be peer supporters for young people. I think we've also seen more innovation come through. And going back to the 2006 reforms that occurred nationally in this country, where we introduced Medicare subsidised access to psychological services. Australia is one of the few countries in the world that offers, through its public health system, subsidised access to psychological services for the benefit of literally thousands of people.
Now, Alan, you've spent a long time at Lifeline and you undertook some really groundbreaking research there. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that as well?
So one of the studies that I was really pleased to be part of was called a social return on investment study of the Lifeline online chat service. Social return on investment is a really fancy term for saying, did it make a difference to anybody and who, and can you measure it? And we found an $8.40 return on every dollar invested in that service. So I get excited about how we've been able to translate research into tangible service improvements for real people.
Alan, we're going to take a short break now and we're going to come back, and when we return, we'll hear from you about some of the community initiatives that you've been involved with and help establish. So if you would like to speak with anyone about mental health or feel you just need someone to talk to, please call Lifeline on 131114 anytime. Someone is standing by and ready to take your call.
If you would like to learn more about Wesley Mission, visit wesleymission.org.au. You can find help in our community services, connect with our church and congregations, discover a volunteer role that suits you, stay up to date on the latest news and information, donate to support our work, and help make a positive difference in your community. You can also connect with us on social media and subscribe to receive the latest news and information about Wesley Mission directly into your inbox. Visit wesleymission.org.au.
Do be in touch if Wesley Mission can be of help to you or a loved one in any way. The contact details are on the screen now. Now, I'd like to continue my conversation with Alan Woodward. He's a Commissioner at the National Health Commission and the Strategic Advisor to Suicide Prevention Australia. Alan, we've just taken a look back at over the last 20 years and the changing attitudes around mental health and suicide in Australia. Why do you think the narrative or the conversations have shifted around mental health, and in the past few years in particular?
Well, I think one of the things that has really shifted is our understanding that there are non-health related factors around mental health conditions and suicide prevention. So the academics and theorists will refer to things called social determinants of health. And what that means is things other than a diagnosable illness can affect our mental health and well-being, can fuel suicidal thoughts and feelings. Things such as the relationships we have with people around us, not able to see your way through financially, not being able to have secure and appropriate housing. All these things can come together to affect a person's mental health and can fuel suicidality. So when we respond to mental health and suicide, we need to start from the assumption that it's a multifactorial phenomena. And this is driving reform for what we might call holistic care, or care that is centred around the needs of the person, whatever the array of those needs might be.
Fantastic, and that's a really helpful answer. Why do you think it's so important for us to engage young people in these conversations, particularly now?
We now know that 3/4 of mental illness will be identifiable in the person's life before they reach the age of 25. So if we're talking about capturing mental illness earlier, intervening or treating in a way that it can be more successful and effective at an earlier stage, making life better for people more quickly, then we have to address mental health issues for our young people quite deliberately. We also know that young people struggle with all manner of pressures and stresses in their lives, that adolescence and early adulthood is a very demanding and difficult time, biologically, mentally, and in other ways. And therefore, we need to be aware that young people may have a vulnerability to suicidal thoughts emerging and suicidal behaviours.
Alan, you live on the south coast of New South Wales, and Over the last little while, you've lost some young people to suicide in that community. Can you share with us how the community has responded where you live?
Yes, we had a really, really difficult year last year where in a fairly short space of a couple of weeks, months, we sadly lost a number of young people to suicide. And, well, what did our community do? The first thing our community did, because it's a strong community, is it reached out to one another in a collective arm of support around each other's shoulders and said, you know, we're going to recognise this for what it is. It's an absolute tragedy. And the sadness was felt community-wide. And we reached out to those who were impacted more closely. But the other thing our community did, which I think was really wonderful, is we started to put yellow ribbons around the place. You know, on the fence outside our houses, around the light poles, around the, the awnings, everywhere we could find, people placed the yellow ribbon. And the yellow ribbon is symbolic of the cause of suicide prevention, as a sign of solidarity with those who have lost loved ones to suicide or experienced the force of suicidality themselves, and as a signal of a commitment that we will work together to prevent suicides and to support each other. And that's exactly what our community did.
Now, you're involved with the Illawarra Shoalhaven Suicide Prevention Collaboration work. Can you talk to us about how that works?
Yeah, it's another great example of the region I live in. And I was there from the start. The idea was, there's so many people were working in the area of suicide prevention, and they usually knew each other because we're not that big a region, several 100,000 people. But we thought maybe we could do more collaboratively. And it brought together people from all different backgrounds. But right from the start, it included people at the grassroots, people from the local suicide prevention networks that have been supported by Wesley Mission, local people simply wanting to do more about suicide prevention. It was a collaborative to try and overcome some of the mismatch between how funding was allocated to particular programs and when that occurred. It brought together specifically the Primary Health Network, which is the Commonwealth Government's mechanism for funding mental health and suicide prevention on a regional basis, and the local health district, which is the state government mechanism. And that's a critical relationship to have working well, because both contribute in different ways, and to bring them together as a shared commitment to the region meant the planning and the strategic issues could be addressed. Private industry has also come in play too, including the big steelworks and all manner of other industry in our region. Because this is what it means. When we talk often this phrase around suicide prevention is everyone's business. And it's a little phrase which is nice, but what we did in this region with the collaborative is we made that real by creating a structure and a forum through which that would occur. And it's continuing to grow and mature and change and revise and pick up insights about what works in our region. It doesn't mean that everything in our region is completely different to every other region. A lot of things, a lot of services we share. But sometimes there's a bit of a nuance or a way in which things are explained. And sometimes simply the cooperative flavour that network brings between workers and managers can make a big difference. And, when we had a sad time in my local community, one of the first things that happened was the Regional Suicide Prevention Collaborative was able to assign a project worker to work with our local community around a whole raft of immediate and medium to long-term responses. It's that sort of reaction that can really make a difference.
Yeah. It's just all those small things coming together to make a big difference when it all is said and done, and that can only happen collaboratively when we all come together to work together towards that common purpose. Alan, why is local community empowerment just so critical in equipping people with skills in the areas of mental health?
Yeah, I guess part of my take on that is I think that we're talking about social change. So, as I said at the start, I come to mental health and suicide prevention from a different background. So I explain it as a movement for social change. I mean, sure, there's a whole lot of things around health professionals and programs and treatments that need to be brought into that. But people don't necessarily access those programs and treatments unless there are good supports around them and they're encouraged to reach out. And as we've talked about, Stu, there are the so-called social determinants, relationships, income and finances, housing, employment, things going on. Communities can help address all of that. But the other thing is, where the community is not content with how things are, whether it be around the number of deaths by suicide and the suffering from suicidal thoughts that people have, whether it be the mental health struggles and the difficulties accessing the right treatments and services, whether it be about housing services or financial counselling services, where communities are not content with how things are, there is hope for change and there is momentum for change. And I think in Australia, we've seen that in the last 20 years by pushing more on mental health reform and suicide prevention reform, and governments and policymakers have listened. But we are not content with where we are.
No.
We want more. We want to reduce the deaths of suicide. Our aspiration is to no deaths by suicide. We want people with mental health issues to have a fully participating life. We want change, and as communities, when we come together, it becomes not just individuals, it becomes a movement for social change.
Yeah, I love that. A movement for social change, movement for social transformation. That's very much at the heart of who we are as Wesley Mission as well. Alan, thank you so much for spending time with us today, having this critical conversation. We're so grateful. Now, if you would like to speak with someone about mental health or feel you just need someone to talk to, please call Lifeline on 131114. Someone is standing by and ready to take your call. I'll be back with you in just a moment.
I think people are amazing. We can turn dark to light. We can fly through storms. We can change worlds, but we can't always do it alone. If you need help, we could work together. Find out more at wesleymission.org.au. We are here for you.
Don't hesitate to be in touch if Wesley Mission can be of help to you, a family member, or a friend in any way. Our details are on the screen now. I'll continue today in my series looking at what it means to be people who are called to have sharp minds focused on working for justice. Last week, I invited you to join others as together we seek to reflect the love, grace, mercy, and justice of God. This week, I'd like to continue to unpack how we can all engage in prophetic witness. You who've been captivated by the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, you who've been enveloped in the love of God the Father, you who have been empowered by the Holy Spirit, who have the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, living and residing in you, you now are called not to live to the pattern of this world, but to live a radically different and other type of life. That's what we're called to be and what we're called to do. We're called to be a peculiar people, as the Apostle Peter calls it. We're called to be weird for all the right reasons. That's who we're called to be. And so our way of life should be a prophetic witness. Because we've been gripped by grace, because we've been enveloped by love, because we've been empowered by the Spirit, we should reflect the grace, the mercy, the love, and yes, the justice of God in the way that we live our life. You see, because God's people, as salt and light in the world, we are called to march to a different beat. We are called to dance to a different rhythm. We are called to sing a different melody. And the church at its best, through the centuries, this is who we have been. About 10 years ago, I read a book by an American sociologist, Rodney Stark, called The Rise of Christianity. He's a secular sociologist. He's not a Christian. But what he does is he examines the explosive growth of the early church. On the day of Pentecost, 120 women and men gathered in the upper room,
And after 300 years of persecution and suffering and pain and setback, that 120 people had become, at least historians estimate, 6 million people, or 10% of the Roman Empire. It was a growth of a religious movement, a proportional growth of a religious movement like the world had never known and has never known since. And so Rodney Stark, he looks at this growth and he says, why did they grow? And we could give him some answers from a spiritual perspective, but he looks at it from a sociological perspective. And the conclusion he comes to, they grew because they were so different. They were radically different to everything around them. For example, he discovered that the early church was radically inclusive. You see, in the Roman Empire, the cities of the empire where so many of the rural people would flock, they were marked by ethnic and religious conflict. They were deeply divided. They were violent. And the church stood out like a beacon because it welcomed all ethnicities, all races, both genders. Everyone was welcome. In the church, there was no slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female. They were all one in Christ. They were radically inclusive. The early church was radically compassionate. In a deeply violent world, they loved their enemies and not just their friends. The church was radically courageous. Back then, pandemics swept through the empire every few decades, wiping out great swathes of the population, and people would flee the cities, fleeing the danger of the cities and the pestilence that was there. But those who stayed behind were the Christians. And they cared not only for their own sick and dying, they cared for others as well. And this marked them out from everybody else. The church was radically different in a world where particularly children were treated like chattels, where infanticide, exposing children to newborn babies, unwanted newborn babies to the weather, allowing them to die, and abortion was absolutely commonplace. That the early church marched to the beat of a different drum. The church was radically egalitarian. Women who were treated as property were elevated and honoured in leadership. The church was radically loving. In a world where an eye for an eye was this common economy, they refused to retaliate, even under threat of death. And so we see the early church, it grew exponentially. Its growth was explosive because it was simultaneously prophetic in its witness, and in doing so, it was attractive. It was radically other and radically inclusive. And even its most profound enemies, the Roman emperors who unleashed persecution after persecution after persecution, they noticed how different the early church was. Emperor Julian, when there was a pandemic sweeping through the Roman Empire, he was quoted as saying, "These godless Galileans," referring to Christians, "feed our poor in addition to their own. Can they stop it, please?" This sort of prophetic witness, as we do justice, it will require spirit-fueled courage, the sort of courage that Sister Anne Rosa demonstrated.
Would you stand with us at Wesley Mission as we fight for justice in our city, our state and our nation? I would like to once again extend an invitation to you to join us as we seek justice in areas like housing and homelessness, gambling addiction and wealth distribution, employment, family breakdown, alcohol and drug abuse, and many other areas. In so many ways, Wesley Mission is rolling up its sleeves, prepared to do whatever it takes to stand with those who are marginalised. Next week, I'll continue looking at how Minds Focused on Justice will engage in prophetic speech and also in prophetic witness. And I'll draw on examples from one of my predecessors, Sir Alan Walker. I'll hope you join me then. I'll be back in just a moment.
At Wesley Mission, we see kindness change kids' worlds. You can find out more at wesleymission.org.au. We are here for you.
I hope you found the conversation with Alan Woodward in today's program beneficial and empowering. If you'd like to establish a Life Force network in your community, please don't hesitate to be in touch. We will all benefit by working together. Also, if you would like to speak with someone about mental health or you just need someone to talk to, please, please, please call Lifeline on 131114. Someone is standing by right now and ready to take your call. I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week here on Wesley Impact. Every blessing to you and those who you love.
Wesley Mission walks alongside people of all ages struggling with homelessness, addictions, mental health issues and financial stress. To find out more, visit wesleymission.org.au.